I'd like to introduce Matthew Pinsker, our next speaker, whose topic is Samuel Wilkinson's Gettysburg Address. Matthew Pinsker is an associate professor of history and the Pahanka Chair in American Civil War History at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where he teaches courses in United States political, legal, and diplomatic history. His research focuses on the career of Abraham Lincoln, partisanship in the Civil War era, American constitutionalism, the Underground Railroad, and the history of U.S. campaigns and elections. He has served as a visiting fellow at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia and leads annual K-12 teacher workshops on the Underground Railroad for the National Endowment for the Humanities. He's the author of numerous articles and books, Lincoln's Sanctuary, Abraham Lincoln and the Soldier's Home, and Abraham Lincoln. Please give a nice welcome to Matthew Pinsker.
Thanks. Appreciate it. So thank you. It's obviously an honor to be here, especially this week of all weeks. But I wanted to always try to do something with the Civil War, with Gettysburg, and with Abraham Lincoln, my particular specialty, that people don't know about. Now, that's a challenge. I mean, I'm a Lincoln scholar. There are a few other Lincoln scholars out there. And there have been a few books written about this relatively unknown American president. But my challenge as a scholar and also as a teacher is to try to say something new. Find new things without making them up, which is an equally big challenge. And I have been working in particular over the last several years with teacher training projects, training K through 12 educators, sharing insights with them about the latest scholarship, using digital tools to try to bring to life the Battle of Gettysburg, the Civil War, and Abraham Lincoln's legacy for classrooms, especially in the United States, in a way that might make it fresh, engage children. And I think I've found, one of the most remarkable stories. It's not something that I've found all alone. I mean, there are scholars who understand or have written about this story, but I found a story about a connection from this battle to the Gettysburg Address that I don't think most people know about. And that's what I want to talk about today. So if you look at your screens, you'll see there's a picture of a man named Samuel Wilkinson staring down at you, a very imposing figure. I have to ask, and I know there are people here who might know who this man is, but how many people know who Samuel Wilkinson was? Raise your hand. Okay, now this is very good, right? This is a crowd full of people who know the Battle of Gettysburg pretty well, at least care about it enough to come here. But when I ask at my different teacher training workshops across the country if they've ever heard of Samuel Wilkinson, the overwhelming response is no. He's not a name that people know anymore. But he is an incredibly important figure, and I'm going to argue today in this little talk that he inspired one of the most significant phrases in the Gettysburg Address. And I'll try to explain all of that, and then I'll be happy to take questions afterwards. So Sam Wilkinson was part of one of the most prominent families in 19th century America. I teach at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. His father was actually from Carlisle, but he moved to Buffalo, New York in the early 19th century, and his father was a great promoter of Buffalo. Buffalo was one of the great 19th century American cities, but not at the time when his father arrived there. He helped promote it as, in the era of the canal building, sort of economic growth of New York State, and became known as a kind of founder of modern Buffalo in 19th century America. And then his son Sam became a lawyer and a journalist, and he married Elizabeth Cady Stanton's sister Catherine. They had a number of children. One of them, the oldest, Bayard Wilkinson, was a soldier who was here at Gettysburg. But Sam Wilkinson is probably best known as arguably the most important war correspondent, newspaper reporter of the Civil War from the North. He was described by one leading historian in the 20th century as the man who introduced the era of the inside operator. And another one describes him as having a vigorous character of lusty humor with unusual powers of storytelling and description. Wilkinson was a kind of legend among reporters. He actually was in part a legend because he was feisty. This is a guy who worked for Thurlow Weed, Horace Greeley, and Henry Raymond at different stages in his career after he got done fighting with each one of them in consecutive order. You probably have heard these names. They may be less familiar to you than some other figures, but Thurlow Weed is kind of one of the great newspaper editors in the 19th century, the Albany Evening Journal editor, a political party operator. They called him the Wizard of the Lobby. Wilkinson began his journalism career working for Weed. They had a falling out, and so then he joined up with Weed's great rival and former partner, but now antagonist, Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley is the famous one of this bunch, the man who gave the famous advice, "Go west, young man." Great journalist, you know, the editor and publisher of the New York Tribune. Wilkeson worked for Greeley for a number of years. He began the war as a war correspondent for the New York Tribune. But in the middle of the war, in 1862, he and Greeley had a falling out. And so he left and then joined up with the New York Times, which during the Civil War was largely directed by Henry Raymond, who's pictured there. Henry Raymond was the editor of the New York Times, also a powerful inside figure. You know, newspapers are different then than they are today. They're not fair and balanced, as the media tends to be in the modern era. They were partisan, and openly so. I mean, Henry Raymond was the editor of the New York Times, and in 1864, he was also chairman of Lincoln's re-election campaign. And so, you know, you have no Chinese wall separating the media from the parties. They were, in effect, newsletters for the political parties. And Wilkinson worked for a series of editors and newspapers that ultimately come to represent the interests of the Republican Party in the North, and he's one of their leading war correspondents. I also mentioned that he has a son. His eldest son, Bayard, was a young man who joined up with the Army early in the war. He had just turned 19 the month before the Battle of Gettysburg. He was an artillery officer, a lieutenant heading up Battery G of the 4th United States Artillery. Young man, well respected, but 19 years old at the time of the battle. He is the pride of the Wilkinson family, and the sort of the gem of his father's eye. And at the battle, on the first day, when Bayard Wilkinson is here with the Army of the Potomac, serving with the 4th U.S. Artillery within the 11th Corps of the Army of the Potomac, his father is traveling up from Baltimore to try to join up with the Army of the Potomac, following General Meade and covering the war in the way that we would describe as being a kind of embedded journalist, right? At the time, during the Civil War, there were journalists like Sam Wilkinson who followed the armies and would hang out by the headquarters of the generals in charge on the field, and then would send dispatches, sometimes by letter, sometimes by telegraph, in order to report on the comings and goings on the front. On the morning of July 1st, Bayard Wilkinson's artillery unit was sent out to the field north of town. And I'm going to read from one of the after-action reports that was issued in July of '63, at the end of the month, by Major Thomas Osborne, who was the brigade artillery commander of the 11th Corps. So this is about a month after the battle is over, and he reports, reflecting back on what happened. This is in the official records of the War of the Rebellion. At about 11 a.m. on Wednesday morning, Lieutenant Wilkinson reached the field and was ordered to report to General Barlow. This is Francis Barlow, commanding the 1st Division of the 11th Corps, which was engaged about 3/4 of a mile from the town and on the left of the York Pike. The battery was assigned a position by General Barlow, and when I reached the ground, I found it unfortunately near the enemy's line of infantry with which they were engaged, as well as 2 of his batteries, the concentrated fire of which no battery could withstand. Now, I know there are people in this tent who could understand how to read between the lines on an after-action report like this. This is bristling with finger pointing, right? This is an artillery officer who is pointing a finger at a divisional commander who misplaced an artillery battery too close to enemy lines This is one of the classic examples, if you are a student of military history, of poor positioning, choosing high ground, a knoll, Locker's Knoll, or later what we know as Barlows Knoll, that creates a salient or a vulnerable position when you should have created or chosen a different terrain that was better situated for military defense and for the protection of your battery. What Osborne is saying is that Barlow doesn't know what he's doing. Now, of course, I think those of you who are here probably also know a little bit of the background of these people. Francis Barlow's not even 30 yet. I mean, this artillery battery officer, Bayard Wilkinson, is 19. Thomas Osborne is just 30 years old himself. These guys were all trained as lawyers, or at least Osborne and Barlow were. They joined up to serve in the war, and they've been elevated pretty quickly. All of them have their own reputations for being brave and good officers, but in this case, they're at odds with each other. Just so you know, Osborne's not as well known as Barlow. Barlow's part of some of the great myths of the Battle of Gettysburg. But Osborne is an interesting figure. He later became a United States Senator from Florida. But in any event, when he reports to General Hunt, the general in charge of artillery for the Army of the Potomac, on July 29, 1863, he's making clear that he thinks that the Battery G of the 4th U.S. Artillery was misplaced. That's a picture of Battery G at what we now know as Barlows Knoll. This is a picture that was sketched by Alfred Whoa, the famous sketch artist for Harper's Weekly. This picture actually appeared in Battles and Leaders after the war, not in Harper's Weekly itself. But it's true that Whoa was an eyewitness to the battle. I think most of you here know they didn't use battle photography to capture action in 1863, at least not at Gettysburg. But they did have sketch artists scattered around representing the different illustrated newspapers and magazines, like Harper's or Frank Leslie's. They are eyewitnesses, and they create the best visual report we have of what the battle was like. Whether or not Whoa was a direct eyewitness to Bayard Wilkinson's action on the morning of Wednesday, July 1st is unclear to me at this point. But he depicts it as if he was, and I think he's relying on a number of eyewitness accounts if he wasn't. Now, you know what happens when you misplace an artillery battery, put them too close to enemy lines, is that they come under this intense fire. And then this is how Henry Hunt relays his report to General Seth Williams, who is an adjutant general in the Army of the Potomac. You can see he's taking words and phrases from the earlier report he received a couple of months prior from Major Osborne, and now he's laying the blame in an even blunter fashion. He says, about 11 a.m., Wilkinson's battery, Battery G, the 4th United States with the 4 12-pounders, the Napoleon pieces, they came up and reported to General Barlow, who posted it close to the enemy's line of infantry, with which it immediately became engaged, sustaining at the same time the fire of 2 of his batteries. In the commencement of this unequal contest, Lieutenant Bayard Wilkinson, 4th U.S. Artillery, commanding the battery, a young officer of great gallantry, fell, mortally wounded, and was carried from the field. Now, at this point, the story is going to enter into the realms of heroic myth. You know, this is going to turn into one of the most dramatic and striking stories of the Battle of Gettysburg. I will tell you, right? There are heroes on both sides. There's all kinds of drama in these 3 days. To me, this story could be the most dramatic, the most important, the most compelling of all. I mean, I would never want to get into a debate comparing these stories, but I'll tell you, there's something special about what happens next to Bayard Wilkinson. Because when he's mortally wounded and carried from the field, what has happened to him is that a shell has hit his leg and nearly severed it. And he is going to be forced to amputate his own leg because surgeons don't have time to amputate it for him. And then what happens after that is what's going to become, you know, one of the great stories of the battle, at least in the 19th century, although it's been a story that's been mostly lost to the public consciousness ever since. What happened was they carried Bayard Wilkinson to the almshouse, which is not far from the Carlisle Pike, north of town. That's a picture of what it used to look like. It no longer stands. While Bayard Wilkinson is there, he is suffering from the after effects of this amputation shock. He's later going to die in that almshouse on the end of the first day. While he's suffering. His father is desperately trying to get up to the battlefield himself. He doesn't arrive on the first day. Sam Wilkinson is not on the field at Gettysburg on July 1st. Of course, neither, by the way, is General Meade, as many of you know. But he does arrive on Thursday afternoon, July 2nd. And what I'm about to do now is try to show you how, using newspaper articles and different accounts from that summer of 1863, we can almost create a kind of hour-by-hour account of this very dramatic story. Because there was another newspaper correspondent who was there on Thursday, July 2nd, a friend of Sam Wilkinson's. His name was Whitelaw Reid. He later became a very prominent newspaper correspondent himself. He was a leading war correspondent for the Cincinnati Gazette. And in one of his dispatches from the battlefield, he writes that Wilkeson, my original companion from Baltimore, was up at last and very sad. He's reporting on Wilkinson's mood on Thursday, July 2nd. His son has died, but he doesn't know it yet. According to Whitelaw Reid, his son, a gallant young lieutenant of regular artillery, had had his leg shot off in Wednesday's disastrous fight, and whether living now or dead, he could not tell. He was a prisoner or a corpse in Gettysburg. You can almost feel the weight of all this as his father is hovering around the Leicester House with General Meade and his senior staff, with other friends who are journalists, wondering what happened to his own son. He's got reports that he was wounded, perhaps mortally, but he doesn't know. There is another report that documents what happened on Friday evening, July 3rd, after the battle was over, when finally Sam Wilkinson could put down his reporting pen and go look for his son. It came out in the Louisville Daily Journal from Kentucky, and it described a kind of touching scene. The generous man, Professor Martin Stover, encountered Mr. Wilkinson while searching for his son's body. Stover was a professor at Pennsylvania College, now Gettysburg College. He owned a home on the Diamond, or the Square, in town. It's now the House of Bender. You're looking at a picture of it there. This is a brick house off the Square that was Stover's home. It served as a kind of temporary hospital for wounded soldiers during the battle. But he sees Wilkinson in the Square on his way searching through town looking for Bayard. And he says that while searching for his son's body, Stover overcame him wholly with his tender outpouring of sympathy and offers of service. He subsequently sought him out and compelled him to come to his home and take food. So, here we have a report from another newspaper describing how a local resident in town saw this father, who was a well-known war correspondent, looking for his wounded son and helped him in a kind of very human way. And you should know that story, embedded in this article titled "The Meanness of the Gettysburgers," was really an article about how cowardly and crass the citizens of Gettysburg were, according to this correspondent, right? The report was all about how some of the residents of town were trying to profit from the battle by charging, exorbitant rates for food, by not providing shelter for wounded Union soldiers, by running away in the face of the battle. Now, I'm not claiming this is true, right? But this is how the reporter was relaying it through the Louisville Daily Journal. A Union state, although a slave state at the time. Now, embedded within that story was the exception, right, to that mean rule, according to this reporter, and that was Professor Stover and what he did for Sam Wilkinson. Bayard Wilkinson died Friday evening. After he died that summer, a number of men who served with him wrote letters to the Wilkinson family. And another newspaper account that I haven't seen reprinted anywhere in the stories that scholars have written about this relates all of their different testimonials to how Wilkinson died. So I'll read it, and then I'll explain why I think this is really significant. So this comes from the New York Independent. It was published on August 27th, 1863. The testimonials begin with one from General Oliver Otis Howard, who was the Corps commander of the 11th Corps, in which Bayard Wilkinson was serving and protecting futilely with that battery on Barlows Knoll. According to General Howard, Bayard Wilkinson's conduct, writing to his father, was, quote, so marked that his brigade commander, that's Osborne, speaks to me of him in the highest terms. A sergeant of his company writes that when the young man was wounded, he cried out, "Take your men, corporal, and return immediately to your piece," meaning the Napoleon.
Afterward, when in agonies of thirst, he asked for a drink, and it was brought, he insisted it should first be offered to a wounded man nearby before he would drink himself. A brave and noble young man, the pride of his father, the center of a circle of affectionate friends, his death in the morning of his life in the service of the good cause is sorrowful but not in vain. Now, the reason why I think this little account is so especially important, just as a scholarly matter, is that, there have been all kinds of stories about Bayard Wilkinson's death that most scholars have been skeptical about. And the most central to this myth has been that while he was dying in the almshouse from shock after amputating his own leg, they offered him water, and he insisted that they give it to other soldiers who were there. And this was from, allegedly, eyewitness accounts. This is reported in Battles and Leaders in the 1880s, and then other scholars have sometimes used it, but they seem to think of it as a kind of post-war myth of the kind of the Gordon Barlow myth that also describes action on Barlow's Knoll. However, this account is from August of 1863. It's from accounts written to the family. They may not be true, right? It's possible they're exaggerating or, in effect trying to comfort the family with testimonials of the good death. But I find it very compelling that I can pull together a narrative of this story almost in real time from contemporary documents, sketches, from testimonials in the letters to the family, from newspaper accounts. And by the way, we also have relics for this story, some of which are on display in the gallery inside the visitor center. We have relics from Bayard Wilkinson, including his sash that was used as a tourniquet and his forage cap. There are other relics in private hands, in private collection, that are not on display here, including his bayonet blade that was used to hold the tourniquet, and allegedly the penknife that he used to amputate his own leg. So it's a remarkably well-documented story in a way that makes me think that we should favor the accounts from the period and not think of them as myth. This was a young hero who died in the most dramatic way possible, showing an awful lot of bravery at 19 years of age. And then we have the next element to this story, which the Park Service treats cautiously. And I'm not going to treat it as cautiously as they do. They may be right, but I'm going to make an argument here that what happens next involves how his father, Sam, turns this account of his son's death into something that shapes the Gettysburg Address. And you can decide for yourself whether it makes sense. Because what happens on Saturday, July 4th, is that Sam Wilkinson finally finds his son's body at the almshouse. And when he finds his son's body, he writes his account of the battle for the New York Times, sitting next to his son's body, writing this lead that I have pictured here. Saturday night, July 4th. Who can write the history of a battle whose eyes are immovably fastened upon a central figure of transcendingly absorbing interest, the dead body of an eldest born, crushed by a shell in a position where a battery should never have been sent, and abandoned to death in a building where surgeons dared not stay? This was published in the New York Times on July 6, 1863. It's a furious opening account from a father who's incredibly angry that he thinks incompetent, inexperienced Union officers sent his son to an unnecessary death. And in fact, Francis Barlow had been a lawyer who had been associated with the New York Tribune before the war, who had worked with and knew Sam Wilkinson. So Sam Wilkinson is probably criticizing him directly from experience, thinking, how in the world could this 29-year-old who used to be a junior staffer at my newspaper have sent my son to this unnecessary death because he doesn't know how to position his men? And it's a furious account that then expands into this dramatic, vivid account of the battle. They later republished it as a pamphlet. They called it Sam Wilkinson's Thrilling Word Picture of Gettysburg. It created a small sensation across the North. But he ends with this. This is from the closing of that article. He says here, "My pen is heavy. O you dead who at Gettysburg have baptized with your blood the second birth of freedom in America, how you are to be envied." Now, of course, he's talking about his own son. And he's using a phrase, the second birth of freedom in America, that I'm about to argue is the birth of the phrase, the new birth of freedom, the one that Abraham Lincoln uses in the Gettysburg Address, that Lincoln, I think, intentionally evokes the memory of Bayard Wilkinson and Sam Wilkinson in order to bring to life these, poetic but abstract words that he uses in the Gettysburg Address. In order to appreciate how Lincoln works, I think we have to start with what he said on Tuesday, July 7th. So, we don't celebrate this date in American history or in Lincoln's biography, but I think we should, because it's, in my opinion, the date that marks the first draft of the Gettysburg Address. Tuesday, July 7th, the reports finally reached Washington that Vicksburg had fallen, that Grant had achieved the surrender at Vicksburg. It took until July 7th for the news from July 4th to reach them. So on Tuesday, July 7th, Abraham Lincoln knows that the Confederates have been driven back from the field at Gettysburg, that Vicksburg has surrendered, and by Tuesday, July 7th, he's probably read Sam Wilkinson's report in the New York Times, which had been published the day before, which he could have read that night or he could have read that morning. Now, I can't prove this latter point, that he read the article, because Lincoln doesn't talk about it. But I'll show you what he's doing here in this response to a serenade, it was called. People show up at the White House and they ask for an impromptu speech. And that's what Lincoln gives them on the evening of Tuesday, July 7th. He says in part of this response, "How long ago is it? 80-odd years since on the 4th of July, for the first time in the history of the world, a nation by its representatives assembled and declared a self-evident truth that all men are created equal." Now this is the first draft of the opening to the Gettysburg Address. How long ago is it becomes the biblical certainty of 77 years ago. The ideas and phrases of this paragraph are the opening of the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln is going to spend the summer of 1863 thinking about this speech and revising it toward the mission statement that becomes the address on November 19th, 1863. He's not going to lose any element of it. He's going to build on all the elements of it, improve them. I'm a college professor. When I teach my students how to write, I show them this, right? Abraham Lincoln is not Abraham Lincoln on his first draft. How long ago is it is not American poetry. It's not the civic religion. But when it becomes 77, then you learn the value of revision and Lincoln's obsessive nature and the way he worked to improve and refine his writings. If you want to understand why Lincoln is a great writer, this is perhaps one of the best ways to do it. But it gets even deeper, I think, because Lincoln is a great writer not just because he rewrites things, but because ultimately he's the most evocative writer in American history. Great writers, literary figures of the Shakespearean quality or the Whitman quality or the Lincoln quality, they are evocative. And they can do that in ways we don't even realize they're doing it, almost like masters of language. This is another section from the response to the serenade. Now listen to these words. "I would like to speak in terms of praise due to the many brave officers and soldiers who have fought in the cause of the Union and liberties of the country from the beginning of the war," Lincoln said. "But I dislike to mention the name of one single officer, lest I might do wrong to those I might forget. Recent events bring up glorious names, and particularly prominent ones, but these I will not mention." This is how Lincoln thinks, right? If you mention some names and leave out others, it insults those who are left out more than it praises those who are included. He's such a shrewd politician. He's thinking about that problem here. He's saying this about the glorious names. I'm convinced, although I can't prove it, right? But I'm convinced it's because he's read accounts like Sam Wilkinson's about his son and about the other people. And he's thinking about the fact that he knows Sam Wilkinson, he knows the family, that these stories are incredibly powerful. He has to figure out a way to capture them without, singling out some names like Bayard Wilkinson, or perhaps in this reference here he's referring to someone like John Reynolds, without singling out an individual, but figuring out a way to evoke those stories in a way that will bring them to life. That's what he's beginning to contemplate on July 7th, Tuesday evening, 1863. And this is what he's going to deliver to us on November 19th, when he comes back here and finally rephrases this in a way that I think intentionally brings back Sam Wilkinson's passage from that New York Times article. When he says at the end of that speech, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Every part of that closing is evoking previous documents from American history. Most scholars know this. I think people under this tent probably know this. But when I train teachers across the country, when I look at textbooks in American history classrooms, they don't just document this. The Gettysburg Address doesn't have footnotes. So people can forget what Lincoln is evoking here. But for example, that phrase, government of the people, by the people, for the people, that's not original to Lincoln. He's paraphrasing an earlier, more famous speech in some ways by Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster's very famous second reply to Hayne in 1830 on the floor of the Senate, the one where he talked about liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. In that same speech, Webster said, "It is, sir, the people's constitution, the people's government, made for the people, made by the people, answerable to the people." That was the most famous speech in America before the Gettysburg Address. It was one of Lincoln's favorite speeches. He read it and reread it. And there were others after Webster, like Theodore Parker, an abolitionist minister, who paraphrased Webster and used him in ways that Lincoln was familiar with. When he ends the Gettysburg Address, he's intentionally evoking Daniel Webster and the spirit of the American past. The opening of the Gettysburg Address evokes the Bible, and it evokes the Declaration of Independence, and the end of the address evokes more recent history. And I think one of the most powerful evocations, the one that we should teach in every classroom, is the evocation of Bayard Wilkinson and his brave death and the way his father encountered it and wrote about it when he called it a second birth of freedom. I think Lincoln is intentionally reminding his audiences of that when he calls it a new birth of freedom. Now, I can't prove any of this, at least not like it's science or a mathematical equation. It's an interpretation. I think even if I'm wrong, right, it's a powerful way to teach the Gettysburg Address, to try to bring it to life. If you look at those words above the pictures of Sam and Bayard Wilkinson, it reminds you of something that we have to struggle to relive for our students, which is that when Lincoln speaks at Gettysburg, and he doesn't mention a single name, and he doesn't use any specific words. He doesn't use the word Union or Confederate or slavery or emancipation. It's just abstract poetry. But it wasn't abstract to the audience in 1863 because they had the powerful emotions of war all around them. Every single one of those families knew somebody who died or sacrificed during that war. Our students don't. Okay? They don't have the same electric connection. They don't have the same rush of images and emotions that people then did. They don't hear the same evocations that people then did. Our students don't hear Daniel Webster when Lincoln closes the Gettysburg Address. They don't hear the King James Bible or the Common Book of Prayer when Lincoln uses phrases like 77. So what we have to do is tell them, show them, and try to get them to feel it. Now, you know, how do you do that? It's the last thing I want to talk about, and then I'll take some questions. And the reason why I had a handout passed around to the people who are under this tent, which is I happen to believe that the best way to tell these kind of stories nowadays is online, digitally, with all kinds of tools. So the Sam and Bayard Wilkinson story that I'm telling today is a story that if you wanted to, you could encounter at this project that I lead at Dickinson called the House Divided Project in every element of its dimensions. You could get pictures of all these people. You could read the original article in the New York Times. You could read the other articles that I mentioned. You could dig deep into this story if you wanted to, all at your desktop, you know, all from your tablet or your mobile phone. You know, there is something powerful about the internet that even print couldn't quite achieve, which is the widespread dissemination of deeply layered stories in a way that can bring them to life with moving images and still images and artifacts and documents. It's not the same thing as coming here. And by the way, for those of you who are here right now and those of you who are coming to Gettysburg, right, there's all kinds of monuments to Bayard Wilkinson here. There are 2 monuments to the 4th United States Battery G, one in the cemetery and one at Barlows Knoll. They have 4 Napoleons arrayed where the battery was positioned. There is all kinds of information about this story available. Like I said, the artifacts in the Visitor Center. But it's a story that people just don't know very well unless they're really immersed in the battle. And I happen to think we need to do better to spread the word. And so what we do at the House Divided Project is we try to create free resources online. Everything we produce is free, designed to try to help teachers bring this stuff to life for kids. We do interactive maps in Google Earth, we do videos, we do clickable word clouds of famous speeches. We do all kinds of things, that try to employ digital tools. The last thing we're doing right now is we're launching a series of open online courses. This is the latest trend in higher education. We're trying to experiment with it in a way that would help both teachers and anybody who's interested. So we're offering an open online course this summer called Understanding Lincoln, which takes stories like this and details like the ones I shared today and tries to present them to people in a way that would be fresh. This is a project that's a partnership between the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History in New York and Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. This open online course is a graduate course for K through 12 educators, but it's also a free open course for anybody who wants to follow along. If you look at your handout, at the bottom of the handout, I have a link to our open online course platform. This is housedivided.dickinson.edu/sites Civil War. This is a place where you could go if you want to register for a free open online course. Last summer, we experimented with one on the Civil War. This summer, we're doing Understanding Lincoln. Registration is open until July 19th. If you want to follow along for free, you can. For those of the educators who are signing up to get full graduate credit for this is going to be a semester-long graduate course. They're actually eligible to win one of 3 all-expenses-paid trips to Gettysburg on November 19th, where the best 3 projects from the class will be presented online from the historic Wills House in a live streaming field trip that will offer people a chance to see what educator students can do, with the digital resources and the tools they develop. I will also premiere then a movie about Bayard and Sam Wilkinson and try to make it, as accessible and teachable as I can. And all of the students, whether they are paying tuition or signing up for free, are eligible to contribute to something that we're building as part of this class. And this is the last thing I want to describe before I open up the floor to questions. We're creating, as part of this class, a multimedia edition of Lincoln's writings. So I've selected 150 of Abraham Lincoln's most teachable documents, with the Gettysburg Address being ranked #1, and then many of his most interesting letters, speeches, notes, and fragments filling out the rest of the 150. We've recorded videotapes of me doing close readings of the documents. There's a theater professor at Dickinson College who's recorded the documents in Lincoln's voice. There are other resources and materials on each document for students and teachers who want to study them. And then what we're allowing or asking everybody who's part of this course to do is help contribute to the materials we're building for this site. So you could do your own close readings, videotape that we would post, or blog posts about one of the documents, or resources that support the documents. We call it class sourcing. Sometimes, if you're familiar with the internet at all, you'll know that the latest trend is what they call crowdsourcing, getting people scattered throughout, the internet universe to contribute remotely to different projects. We're trying to organize that crowdsourcing through this class, and that's why we're calling it class sourcing. But what it means is, if you like this stuff, if you're interested in, sharing and publishing some things, this might be a format for you. So with that, I'd like to open up the floor to questions, if anybody has them, or comments. They'll pass around a microphone. And if anybody needs a handout, they're also distributing it now, if you missed it. And if anybody is watching this on videotape, all you have to do is Google House Divided Project, and you can get right to our network of websites. The online course is called Understanding Lincoln. It's offered from Dickinson College and Gilder Lehrman, and registration for that closes on July 19th.
Thank you. I'd like to start by congratulating you on your your work with educational technology,
Thank you.
your sense of historical accuracy, and your scholarly tradition. It's very impressive. You obviously have a great future here in Gettysburg, and I'm glad to hear you'll be here on November 19th. That's just wonderful.
He's not a relative.
I'm not, no.
But
My question.
I may have paid him a small gratuity. Yeah.
My question is, in your research, did you uncover any Confederate account of the attack on Bayard's position? Anything from the Confederate perspective?
So that is a very good question. There are Confederate accounts of the fighting near Barlows Knoll. I didn't include any of them in my presentation today, but I definitely plan to include them in this documentary film we're incorporating. It's a really well-documented moment. I think I kept referring to the Barlow-Gordon story. I think some of you know this myth quite well. Francis Barlow, the divisional commander that Osborne and Hunt are so angry about, that Wilkinson's father is so upset about, he's the young officer who was mortally wounded, at least they thought. John Gordon claimed that he helped him, the Confederate general, and then after the war they met up. He thought Barlow had died. He said, "Are you the Barlow who was, are you related to the Barlow who died at Gettysburg?" And Barlow said, "I am the Barlow who died at Gettysburg." It's none of that's true. At least I haven't researched this myself. It seems to be a kind of hyperbole invention by Gordon, a former Confederate general and then later post-war politician. The Park Service Rangers have done an awful lot of work on that story, and they've deconstructed it. I don't think any leading scholar believes that story's true. But in the course of investigating that episode, they've turned up a lot of Confederate accounts of the fighting there at Barlows Knoll, some of which describe the artillery fight. Now, they're not going to identify Wilkeson by name. He's a 19-year-old second lieutenant. But what they are going to describe are elements of the artillery fight that seem to support the after-action account that Osborne gave Hunt and that Hunt relayed to Seth Williams. Okay.
The statements and the Webster's speech, all that, the statement that Lincoln made, I think, was or July 7th, but he wasn't invited to speak at the Gettysburg address till November.
Right.
And yet, what these the similarities came out later, which leads me to believe, was he working on a potential speech all the while, or was it just he had to go back and do some research for the speech a couple months later?
Yeah. So that's actually a really important question, because if you want to understand how Lincoln worked as a writer and as a political leader, you have to realize that he kept a kind of writer's journal, where when he read something or encountered something that he thought was worth remembering, he would write it down in kind of notes. He would often rewrite elements of what he had read in his own words. And then we have these fragments in his papers. So one of the greatest discoveries, when you really get deep into Abraham Lincoln, is that we have all these fragments that are clearly notes to himself that he files away and then uses later. And they are like the rings of a tree showing how speeches came together. If you're really interested in this, two of the writers who've done some of the best work on this are Douglas Wilson, a leading Lincoln scholar who wrote a book called Lincoln's Sword, about how Lincoln wrote, and then also Ronald White, who's a particularly good scholar on Lincoln's speeches, who's written a biography of Lincoln that talks all about these notes and fragments in a way that brings the process of Lincoln's writing to life. And that, I think, answers your question. Because you're right, on July 7th, Abraham Lincoln has no idea he's going to be invited to dedicate a Soldiers' National Cemetery. But he does know that there are elements of this conflict that he wants to define in some way for the public, and he's beginning to organize them. And when he comes back to those notes and fragments in October and November, when he's thinking about his dedication speech, I think he draws directly from those experiences. I think, but I can't prove, right? Because Lincoln does a lot of things, but he doesn't keep a diary. And he doesn't, confess to anything, and there were no tapes in the White House in the Lincoln era. So, I can't prove any of this the way you might want me to.
what was Barlow's reaction to Wilkinson and Osborne?
Yeah. The finger pointing went both directions. He has his own side of the story. His accounts that I've seen come from much later, but I think that with a little more digging, we might find some more accounts from the period from Barlow. But no, he doesn't accept any of this criticism from Osborne and Hunt. He has another version of the story which defends his position. It's a kind of parallel story to the one that involves Dan Sickles, right? Both of these guys create salients that make them vulnerable to fire and attack. Both of them, after the battle, defend what they did as the necessary step. Everybody who's criticizing them is Monday morning quarterbacking, in other words, and Barlow is, not yielding any ground on this.
Hi. I actually thought that was really funny what you said about your students and revising. I just graduated with an American history degree, and so I thought that was really funny. And my question was actually, for when you did your research, going about doing that, did you mainly use the internet, or did you travel around to places such as the Library of Congress or universities, or did you also use ProQuest too?
Yes.
Right.
Okay, so these are good questions, very practical ones. Nobody who does good research for this period could just use the internet. But I will say this, and not every historian agrees with me, I don't think you can do good research anymore if you just go to archives. I think you have to do both. If you don't use digital tools, you're a fool, because they're so wonderful in certain ways. You have to be able to use both, okay? And I'll give you an example of how digital tools pay off. I claimed in this talk that I had never seen anybody use that account from the Independent, the New York Independent, the one that included what I think of as the origins of the story about how he passed over the water when he was dying. I only found that because of ProQuest and other digital tools that you mentioned. When you can do full-text searching in newspaper databases for the Civil War era, you can find things that you're not going to come across just going document by document or collection by collection in archives, unless you're really diligent and also really lucky. So, nowadays, if you're not doing both, you're not really, in my opinion, doing right.
Here we go again. Very nice talk. I am very enamored of your thematic sleuthing and looking for the fragments. And I'm particularly interested in the Second Birth of Freedom, as you just mentioned. A quick question about the timeline for that.
Yeah.
You said that on July 7th, that particular fragment was published and in a newspaper. I presume it was the New York Times or one other.
Yeah.
Question is, would Lincoln have actually read it on that day?
Yeah.
Because it was not an online world then.
So, very, very good question as well. And it's one that I've been asking myself. The Wilkinson story in the New York Times appeared on Monday morning, July 6th. Lincoln responds to the serenade on the evening of Tuesday, July 7th, and his response to the serenade, it's a little impromptu speech. It's reported in northern newspapers on July 8th. The New York Times and many other newspapers reported it on July 8th. So my question, your question is, could Lincoln have read Wilkinson's article the same day it came out or the next day? And the answer, according to my best guess, and I double-checked myself with another leading scholar named Harold Holzer, who's going to be here tomorrow, and who's writing a book about Lincoln and the press, and who's one of the leading experts on Lincoln and the Civil War press. He's convinced that Lincoln would have seen it Monday night, that Lincoln had same evening access to the New York Times and used it, or at the very latest would have seen it the next day. I feel the same way, but I can't prove that he read it because he never talks about reading it. I mean, Lincoln sometimes told people he didn't read the newspapers because he knew more than they did. But I think he was, not lying, but I think that was a dig, not the truth. I think he read, especially the Times, on a regular basis, and he would have, if he didn't seek out the Wilkinson article on his own, one of his aides would have brought it to him right away, because that is one of the most powerful pieces of journalism that appeared during the war, and it was written by somebody who was a friend of the president's.
I'd like to thank you for bringing this really poignant and maybe underappreciated story to light, because I think it is a fascinating story. But one of the themes that you see throughout this is the notion of finding justification and this higher purpose for the war, and that you see that in the Gettysburg Address. It propagates through to the ounces of blood drawn by the sword versus the lash in the second inaugural. And I'm wondering, see if I can get you to speculate a bit more. Do you think that this is sort of the point at which Lincoln crystallizes in his own mind the need for that justification? That we've up to this point it's been a terrible war, but now we're seeing just massive casualties, and there needs to be a reason for it. There has to be a purpose that's higher. Is this perhaps the point at which that becomes crystallized in his own mind?
So let me pull the slides back, because it's an interesting comparison between how Lincoln evokes God and how Sam Wilkinson did it. Because I didn't read that part of the end of his newspaper account, but I could have. Let me just pull this back. So this is the end of Sam Wilkinson's account that was published on July 6th. He says, "Oh, you dead who at Gettysburg have baptized with your blood the second birth of freedom in America, how you are to be envied." And then he adds, "I rise from a grave whose wet clay I have passionately kissed, and I look up and see Christ spanning this battlefield with his feet and reaching fraternal and lovingly up to heaven. His right hand opens the gates of paradise, and with his left he beckons to these mutilated, bloody, swollen forms to ascend." That's 19th century rhetoric and prose. They thought that was incredibly powerful and moving. People today might find that incredibly powerful and moving, but I don't think Lincoln does, because this is how he writes it, that this nation under God. And that phrase "under God," he doesn't even have in his original drafts. The first two speaking copies we have, the Hay draft, the Nicolay draft from the Gettysburg Address on November 19th, omit the phrase "under God." He added it probably extemporaneously and then wrote it into the subsequent drafts. The one that we have on the Lincoln Memorial Wall is not from the draft that he actually delivered in Gettysburg. Lincoln was much subtler, and much more restrained in evoking God than other people were in his day. I personally, and this is an argument point, not a fact, but I personally don't think he ever once doubted that the war was justified, that he never really suffered from any wavering on that front. That's one of his great strengths as a commander-in-chief. While other people were buckling, he never buckled, right? However, I think your question is right in that he understood by 1863 that if he wasn't wavering, there were plenty of other people who were. And that what he had to do as a president was reach out to them and convince them that it was worth it, that these dead shall not have died in vain. And that was a constant effort of his, beginning in 1862, but accelerating in 1863, to find new and innovative ways to reach the reading public in the North. 1863 is the year when Lincoln unleashes a series of public letters in a way that no president had ever done before. And it culminates with this address in Gettysburg on November 19th. Lincoln doesn't give very many speeches during the Civil War. He gives the inaugural address, he gives the second inaugural address, and he gives the Gettysburg Address and a handful of other impromptu or very contained speeches to sanitary fairs or before soldiers. He's not giving many orations. So I think this is, his way of addressing those who are wavering in an important election year. 1863 is a state election year, and of course the presidential election year is coming next. Okay? Thank you very much. Enjoy your week.